go check out this crow. Actually, it might be a raven.
We need Stefan up here. He's a birder. You're a birder too.
Yeah, hold on. I brought my monocular.
He literally is a birder. He brought his monocular.
Hello, I'm the freshest in the place. When I laps with my vibe and you can't keep the pace. Head to toe while I'm dripping in style. I'm fly with $1 million smile.
Had a really good breakfast at a diner nearby. Got a little greasy, but like, yeah, grease is fuel.
Welcome everyone to the Velo Field Test, where we are testing a slew of all-road bikes here in beautiful Marin County in Northern California. One of those all-road bikes is this, the Specialized Roubaix SL8, which in the world of all-road really leans into the all component of this. With that, you're getting 40 mil tire clearance front and rear. That's even with the front derailleur mounted. You're also getting a future shock up front, which offers up to 20 mil of compliance. We'll talk more about that later. You're getting a super flexy seat post. And honestly, you're getting a ton of mounts here. If you were to look at a gravel bike from a few years ago, it would probably look a whole lot like this, even though this bike is purely in the all-road side of the spectrum, right? So with that being said, let's first talk about the future shock. What's the difference between a future shock and more of a traditional suspension, Josh?
Yeah, so when you think about suspension, what suspension really does is it keeps the tire in contact with the road surface. That's the point of suspension. But with the future shock, it just makes for a more comfortable ride. It does not affect how well that tire stays in contact with that road surface.
Okay, now let's talk about handling. What do you think of this bike?
This bike is a little bit longer wheelbase and it is a lower bottom bracket. And this really leans towards the all-road, as you said, or even a gravel bike. It is like right on that edge. And so the handling, it is a little bit slower. And I think we might disagree about this a little bit, but I think that's especially true when you have the future shock all the way open. It's just a little bit slower to turn in and you feel a little bit less connected when you're descending. Now, when you're climbing with it, or even in the flats, I don't feel the future shock at all. It feels straight and true. It feels plenty responsive. You really don't lose anything. It's just a more comfortable ride. And part of that is also at the front, there's the future shock, but at the back, there is the pave, and it's this seat post that provides a ton of flex in the back.
Yeah, I think we do have some disagreement with that future shock because I tended to keep that thing open all the time. Is there a little bit of a delay when you turn in compared to something else here, like that BMC Road Machine reviewed? I think so, just a little bit. I don't think that negatively affects the bike by any means.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's negative at all. It is a little bit different, again, than traditional suspension though. With traditional suspension, I usually feel very confident with handling because you sort of sink into it as you come around the corners and it sucks up the little bumps. This just keeps you feeling comfortable through the turns, but I don't think it has quite the same effect as traditional suspension.
All right, Josh, I'm gonna stop you right there because we've talked so much about that future shock. We just need to get to the nuts and bolts about handling.
Yeah, so it's hard because it's such a different bike with it on versus off, but I'm gonna try not to mention it again, and I'm gonna say when you're riding, no, I have to mention it.
Yeah,
when you're riding with it open, then it is a little bit slower of a handling bike. It takes a second for things to happen. You really have to commit with your hips, and you have to be willing to go through that corner leaned over. Now, if you lock it out, it is like a different bike. The handling is quite sharp when it's locked out, although it is one of the longer wheelbase bikes that we have on test. So there is always going to be that. Longer wheelbase bikes are just a little bit slower to turn in.
Yeah, it's, again, as you said, it's a tale of two bikes really. It's one bike that feels kind of not quite ponderous, but definitely not tight. And then you twist that knob and all of a sudden you have something that feels much more like the Road Machine. I also remember when we were doing kind of the flat time trial test, you were talking about being able to put your hand position more of a puppy paw because this is just soaking up so much of the stuff underneath you, right?
Yeah, that's true. So we didn't do that in the test because we wanted to keep everything the same, but I do always like to sort of test that. And it is crazy how easy it is to lean because you don't have any padding right here. And so when you're leaning on the tops like that, it can be hard with most bikes. But the Future Shock really makes that easy to be in that super aero position.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about that Future Shock up front. We should probably talk a little bit about what's going on with that seat post, right?
Yeah, so in the rear, it's called the pave seat post. And it already, you can see that there's a good amount of seat post just showing there to start with. But then it doesn't actually, the seat post binder is not right at the top where the top tube is. It's down in the seat tube. It just allows for a lot of movement forward and backward to really soak up the bumps and do its best to keep up with the Future Shock at the front.
Okay, so we've talked handling, we've talked ride comfort. We should probably touch a little bit on the spec of this bike, which I think you really liked, right?
Yeah, so I did. One thing that's really interesting, it is actually running gravel wheels. And I love that because the 25 mil internal width is just gonna make for a more comfortable ride. You just have more air volume. You can go lower in the air pressure if you wanna do that. And I always tell people, when you're looking at wheels and you're having a hard time figuring out two that are very close, I generally say choose the wider internal width.
Okay, so you obviously like the wheels, but I do think that Specialized kind of nailed the rest of the build kit here, right?
Yeah, I know that you are a big fan of the bars, which come up a little bit. Sometimes I like my bikes a little bit lower in the front, but this actually rises up 15 millimeters. And I do think it makes a lot of sense for this bike to have that extra height, because that's part of what makes an all-road bike an all-road bike, is it's a little bit shorter and it's a little bit taller.
What about that saddle?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of the saddle. What the saddle does is that it uses 3D printing in the way that 3D printing really is meant to be used. It does what no other saddle can do, which is that it's stiff in the places that you think it should be stiff, and it's softer than a regular saddle could be, because it can control the difference in stiffness versus softness very specifically. Like, so right where you need it to be soft, that's where it's soft. And this thing is a joy. And then of course there's Ultegra, which Ultegra Di2, I'm just never gonna complain about it. It's just so good.
Yeah, it's got the built-in 4-eyes power meter, which you don't see too often on an all-road bike like this, but I'm glad they have it here, especially at this price point, which is admittedly pretty high. All right, on to the livability portion of this review with the Specialized Roubaix SL8. Now, if you were to look at the spec sheet of this bike, you would probably give this a high rating. It's got a threaded bottom bracket, and it's got the external brake hoses as well. However, I'm gonna give this a 6 out of 10, and let me explain. As far as livability is concerned, I think the big question here is gonna come to the Future Shock, and that's perfectly valid. I do think if you're riding this bike on a lot of gravel and dirt roads, you will find that that Future Shock cartridge, which itself is not serviceable and requires replacement once it wears out, is probably gonna wear out more quickly. That being said, this being an all-road/road application, I don't worry about that long-term durability quite as much, or the dirt intrusion with this cartridge. I also find that Specialized has the 2-year warranty for this cartridge, which I think is nice to have separate of the bike. I personally do have some worries about water intrusion, specifically at the seat post area, because the seat post wedge itself is recessed about 65 millimeters from the top of the top tube of the frame, whereas with most bikes, they're right at the top, easy to access, easy to adjust. That being said, Specialized has spec'd a really hardy rubber gasket at the top of this thing, and it's been so good, frankly, that some of our testers here have had trouble removing the rubber gasket to adjust the seat post height. And frankly, that fitment continues to the rest of the bike. I do think that the small parts on the rest of this bike are pretty high quality. While this bike is set up with Shimano Di2, you can set this bike up with mechanical shifting. There is a little plate on the top of the down tube that allows you to do that fairly easily and seamlessly, although you do have to run full shift housing from the shifter down to the derailleurs. One last thing that I do like about this Roubaix is that if you look at the seat tube, there's a little porthole that allows you to check for the minimum insertion height of that seat post. Because the wedge is so much lower than on other bikes, you can't extend this seat post quite as high as you would on another bike. Overall, once again, I give this a 6 out of 10. I do have some worries about the Future Shock longevity here and replacement because it's non-serviceable, but the rest of the bike, I would say, gets high marks. So we've talked a lot about what we like about this bike. We've talked about the spec. Let's wrap it up. Let's start with the pros, cons, and then who this bike is for.
Okay, so let's talk about the pros first. And I think what you really have to think about is what this bike is aimed at. And this bike is aimed at rougher roads, even a little bit of off-road if that's your thing. And to support that, you get the Future Shock You get the pave rear that gives you that flex there. And I'm gonna call out the 25 mil internal wheels again because I just love having more air volume in the wheels and the tires.
Yeah, okay, so obvious pros, what about cons?
Yeah, so the cons, I'm gonna touch on the Future Shock again because it's an interesting thing. The Future Shock is really great because it adds that extra 20 millimeter of movement, but at the same time, I have to wonder, is it really necessary? It seems a little bit overly complex depending on your use. It would be great if you had the choice. If you could choose this Roubaix with everything the way it is, without the Future Shock, or for those that prefer it to have the Future Shock.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key values of the field test is that you can ride bikes back to back. And as for me, I found that there's a dramatic difference between a bike with the Future Shock and a bike without it. That being said, there's also a reason why there are a ton of like Future Shock delete kits out there.
Yeah.
Because even though Specialized says that they're committed to this platform for a long time, and they have it across a bunch of different bikes, you know, I do worry about that long-term longevity of something like this, because it's going to need to get repaired or replaced eventually.
One thing that is interesting, and is probably a con, is that there's no down tube storage on this, which seems very weird from the company that arguably invented down tube storage. And this is their bike that it would probably make most sense on, so I sort of wonder why it's not there. Now you do have bento box mounts up top, but it feels to me a little like it makes the frame feel like it came out longer ago than it actually did.
But Josh, they got to differentiate it somehow from the Diverge, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I guess so. And also, I do want to touch on one thing. I just have to. I forgot in the pros to say, come on, this paint. It's so nice.
Yeah,
it just
yeah,
has
it
this
really is
sparkle in the sun. I mean, it's okay if you buy a bike based on how it looks, and this paint is pretty damn incredible.
Yeah, I think if anything, we encourage it.
Yes.
So long as the other like requirements are met, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, with that being said, who's the Specialized Roubaix SL8 for?
So this is the bike that you want to think about if maybe you are riding rougher roads, and that could be broken pavement, or you know, if you live somewhere where there's a lot of unpaved farm roads that are actually pretty smooth, but they're not paved, this would be ideal. Being able to put those 40 mil tires in there is like, that is crazy for something that in theory is aimed at road. So I think that in the scheme of the bikes that in the all-road category, this is the bike that you're looking at if you want something a little bit longer, a little bit more stable, a little bit able to handle rougher things better.
Yeah, I really do think like we have some division on final opinion here, but there's no denying the key good things about this bike, I would say. All right, everyone, that's a wrap for the Specialized Roubaix SL8 review. Stay tuned for more things to come from the Velo Field Test, more reviews. We'll see you on the next one. Happy trails.